Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's Boards of Canada, Odds and Ends. Okay everyone, so I've been working on this on and off since before the Tomorrow's Harvest review. I did a video like this for Aphex Twin, and there was a lot of stuff I didn't cover because I wasn't interested enough and there was just so freaking much of it. Boards of Canada aren't gonna be like that as much. Now, spoilers, just like with Aphex Twin, I don't love or even particularly like everything BOC has ever done. And by request, I'll also discuss some of their leaked, unreleased tapes as well. I'm obviously not going to cover Play by Numbers or Closes Volume 1, as I've never heard them, and there's a good chance if you tell me you've heard them, you're either full of shit or you've been fooled by a fake. Well, I have heard a 1-minute preview of a song from Play by Numbers that seems genuine, and quite frankly it sounded like complete ass, so yeah, you can count on my not seeking that out. They've got a lot of insanely obscure stuff that, quite frankly, I've just gotten nothing but headaches trying to find, as their unreleased tracks are a complete chaotic mess of fake releases and tracks exclusive to certain live sets. Sometimes looking through this stuff feels like it's running through a maze with the exit sealed off. A lot of this stuff I don't even want to bother, as I may like this band, but I don't like them that much. If I don't cover your favorite Boards of Canada song, then I'm afraid you'll have to just deal with it, because I just don't have the time to wade through the unorganized mess of unreleased stuff. Aphex Twin is probably over 3 times as big and more easy to wrap your head around sometimes. But I covered all the big ones, I think, so since I'd rather not make this whole video about my headaches surrounding BOC's rare releases, let's just get right into it. I'll start out by discussing the actual readily available EPs, starting off with Twoism, and also starting off by pissing everyone off. I think BOC's debut EP, Twoism, is just okay. Anytime I've tried to listen to it actively, it's either fallen into the background or made me fall asleep. I think with enough repeat listens I've finally been able to get into the first track, 69er, but the rest is either re-released elsewhere, like See Ya Later and Smoke's Quantity, both of which are good, but I prefer in the context of High Scores and Music Has the Right to Children, respectively, or just not a particular standout to me. Oi Rectine, Ice Coolie, and the title track are fine. They've grown on me slightly since first hearing them, but aren't particularly memorable to me. I'm also not a big fan of the track Bass Free. While it is interesting that they would make such a percussive track, it's not that fun to listen to, save for the flute riff at the end, which eventually became part of Triangles and Rhombuses. I mean, there's nothing on here I outright dislike, but to me it always felt like a demo tape that BOC threw together in order to get Warp Records to notice them. The overall sound of this EP isn't too far removed from the usual artificial intelligence sound that Warp was promoting at the time. Maybe a bit moodier, more atmospheric, but not exactly pushing the envelope. I think they hadn't really got the chance to show what a unique act they could be yet. I mean, fine if you like it, I'm sure most people like it more than me, but all it's got for me is 69er, and otherwise I'd rather listen to something they came up with later. I think a 6.5 out of 10, insert booing here. Next up is High Scores. Now, for those of you who will inevitably be pissed off by my not being impressed with Twoism, you can rest easy knowing that I love their next EP. Sure, like Twoism, there's a couple of repeat tracks that appear elsewhere, most notably Turquoise Hexagon Sun, which is probably better in the context of Music Has the Right to Children, but everything else is solid. And yeah, it's also really artificial intelligence-y, in some areas even more so than on Twoism. The track June 9th could have been a cut from Oudaker's Incunabula, and the title track is also heavily percussive, kinda like Bass Free from Twoism if it were actually good. The track Nulagax also has this weird 80s feel to it that's totally unlike any of their other stuff, or public stuff at least, although the abstract synth melodies are pretty par for the course. This track in particular I found to be a particular grower as of late. And the track See Ya Later, while rehashed from Twoism, I think I like it better in this context. Instead of having similar melodies to the other tracks on Twoism, I mean, this has a similar beat to the other tracks on High Scores, but its weird, drunken, abstract atmosphere, I think helps add a little variety on this end. But of course, we all know the real reason this EP is so well remembered, and it's of course the ending. Everything You Do Is a Balloon. Not only the best ending on any BOC release ever, but it's probably their most well-known track. After about a minute and a half of sparkly soundscapes, these big pillowy synth pads come in, and the track forms together this incredibly relaxed and chilled out vibe. This track is one of the best they've ever done, and really was the moment where BOC showed they weren't just any old IDM outfit. Overall, this EP is definitely a must listen, solid 8 out of 10. Next up, In the Beautiful Place Out in the Country. Now, this EP is being notable for being the only EP of theirs not to contain any material in common with the albums. Everything on this EP is exclusive to this EP. And that fact alone is pretty refreshing to me. Now, personally, I think I prefer High Scores a little more despite this, but it's pretty solid. I think the only track I'm not particularly taken by is the last one, Zoetrope, or however you pronounce it. The repetitive synth notes wear out on me after a while, and the title track on here, while I like a lot, it also reminds me of another track by a band I really like but you've never heard of called Bent. They have a track called I Remember Johnny that sounds fairly similar to this one. Got similar sounding vocoders and chilled out vibe. And in case you're wondering, yeah, while the album that track came from, Programmed to Love, came out in the same year as In the Beautiful Place Out in the Country, it beat it by a couple of months, so yeah. I highly recommend checking that album out. It was on my number 20 of favorites of all time list. But going back to this, I very much enjoy the breezy and chilled out Kid for Today. While not exactly the musical pillow that is Everything You Do Is a Balloon, it comes fairly close. Another one of those songs that is just great to soak up all the atmosphere in. And the track Ammo Bishop Roden is another one of my all-time favorite BOC tracks. The somewhat abstract beat paired up with the sad synth pad melodies, it all adds up to one of the most emotional tracks BOC have ever done. Overall, In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country is a pretty nice EP, nothing mind-blowing, but definitely worth your time. 7.7 out of 10. And then there's TransCanada Highway. Okay, given that this EP was released shortly after the Campfire Head phase, it should come as no surprise that the material on here is not a particularly far cry from the material on there. That being said, this EP automatically gets points off for rehashing Day Van Cowboy completely unchanged. I mean, that was my favorite song off of Campfire Head phase, and I let Twoism and High Scores off despite having songs in common with Music Has the Right. But TransCanada Highway doesn't really have that excuse because it came out after Campfire Head phase. And there's also a remix of it by Odd Nozdam, which is weird. Not something I'd like to listen to more than once, quite frankly. That leaves two unremarkable interludes, Heard from Telegraph Lines and Under the Coke Sign, and then two other exclusive full-length tracks, which actually make this EP worth giving a shit about. Left Side Drive and Skyliner. Between those two, I prefer Left Side Drive, being of the warmer variety and could have been one of the standouts on Campfire Head phase, but the colder synth patterns of Skyliner are pretty nice as well. Neither are particular favorites, though, and as such, I almost never find myself returning to this one. For me, it's a 6.7 out of 10. Insert booing here. Now, before I get into the unreleased tapes, I'd like to discuss some other tracks of theirs that they've released publicly. First, there's the B-side on the Aquarius single called Chinook. It's this really percussive and dark track that doesn't sound like anything else they'd ever made. Almost like a take on an Outakers-style track. Really interesting. Next, on the Peel Session EP, there's a track called Happy Cycling, which I'm aware is included as a bonus track on the iTunes version of Music Has the Right to Children, but it wasn't on my version of that album, so that's why I'm discussing it here. Big surprise, it is a great song. It's got a kind of bouncy, almost acoustic beat, with these unsettling choirs in the background, and some occasional seagull sounds and chopped up vocal snippets, bop that. But at around the 5-minute mark of this track, the melody changes into something closer to Roy G. Biv and takes a song that was otherwise just spooky and atmospheric into one of their best tracks, in my opinion. I think this track also fits right at home among Music Has the Right to Children, and I'm gonna add that on my iPod as soon as I get the chance. Now, on the subject of the Peel Session EP, I have also heard there was a track on there called XYZ that got removed for copyright reasons. And big surprise, it's most people's favorite. I think I prefer Happy Cycling personally, but this track also has a cool psychedelic vibe and is certainly worth checking out. And there's also a track they released on the Warp compilation, We Are Reasonable People. The track is called Orange Romeda. This one looked intriguing, but to be honest, is unremarkable. And there's another track on some random vinyl sampler called Korona, which is interesting because it actually has a strong and really fast-paced beat behind it, one of the more up-tempo songs I've ever heard them make. I suppose it's worth a listen, but not a huge favorite for me. There's also a bonus track on the Japanese version of Campfire Head Phase called Macquarie Ridge, and to be honest, I kinda wish I'd had this on my own version as well. I think it fits the more laid-back and sunnier tones better than Farewell Fire did. Nice track there for sure. And then finally there's the track 747, which is on a Warp 20 compilation called Underheard, I think. And holy shit, this track completely blew me away when I first heard it. BOC have never made a song that sounded quite so huge. The ambient pads are accentuated by these subtle choirs, and the beat is huge and banging. It's almost like BOC's take on the future sound of London or something. Love it. So now that we're through the public releases, let's get into the obscure tapes and all those, starting out with Bach Maxima. Now, to be perfectly honest, I have the probably unpopular opinion that this tape, like TransCanada Highway, isn't really worth your time unless you're a hardcore BOC fan. I mean, there exists an upload of this tape on YouTube that intentionally retains the shitty audio quality, and if that's your thing, then that's cool. But for the most part, this is just an unfinished and unrefined demo of Music Has the Right to Children, with some tracks from Twoism and High Scores and the old tunes compilations that I'm going to be talking about later. As far as I can tell, the only tracks that are exclusive to this release are Niagara, Red Moss, Concourse, and Whitewater. These are all fine tracks. They're good, and I suppose they're worth a listen. But to be honest, they're not exactly what I would consider to be BOC's top-notch material. I'd rather just go listen to Music Has the Right to Children, personally. But that's just me, I guess. Out of those exclusive tracks, I think Whitewater's probably my favorite, followed by Concourse. But again, not head over heels in love with them. I'm not going to give this one a rating, as it's basically all just stuff I've either talked about already or will talk about. And now we get to the meat of BOC's unreleased material, starting off with a few old tunes. I'm going to be honest, listening to a few old tunes for the first time made me feel like I was reading someone's diary. I mean, I don't think it was BOC's choice to have all this stuff released, like some family member or friend leaked it to the internet and let that wildfire spread. And I think it kinda shows on this one. These tapes are basically these guys' backlog of material that they didn't feel was good enough for the mass public to hear, and it's all in really low quality audio, again because cassette rips or something. The result of a lot of it is that it's like BOC's equivalent to Jean-Michel Jarre's Deserted Palace album. It sounds like it was made using vintage equipment, and it sounds like they didn't know what they were doing yet at the time, and it gets very weird at times. But it still carries a lot of characteristics that they would go on to show in their public releases. But boy, let's talk about those weird moments. There's some that focus on really blatant and obvious samples, like Light Clear Hair, which is two girls talking about their hair. Or Devil, which is some kind of vacuum cleaner commercial, I don't really know. Or Blockbuster, which is from some kind of game show. Or Sack, which is like electronic circus music. Or Trapped, which takes some kind of soul a cappella and just slaps it over a typical BOC kind of production. And weirdly enough doesn't sound that bad. Or Happy Cycling and Original Logex, which sound absolutely nothing like their final publicly released versions. Or I Love You, which is Color of the Fire. But the weirdest track of all on this entire release, and the weirdest thing I've ever heard out of BOC, and probably my least favorite BOC song as well. The track The Way You Show is a bunch of chipmunk vocals placed over a sample of Celebration by Kool and the Gang. When I got to this track, my "this is not my business" senses went off like nuts. Not only is that almost unchanged copyrighted material so gee, what possible reason could they have not to release it? But also, I have no idea what the point of it was, aside from the fact that the Sanderson brothers were just messing around. That being said, there were actual highlights on here that could have been turned into decent BOC tracks, like Spectrum, Finity, Forest Moon, Mansell, Sequoia, and 5978. I was expecting this release to be mostly minimalistic and boring, while there are more than a few minimalistic tracks, it's anything but boring. It's a weird collection, and I don't feel totally right spreading it around, but BOC fans don't seem to have any problems diving right into their private backlogs, so I guess I'd recommend it too. I think 7.3 out of 10, pure enjoyment-wise. And then Old Tunes Volume 2 is mostly the same deal as the first one, but it took a lot longer for this one to sound even remotely like the same band. The first song on here that sounded like a BOC, I think, was track 18, Mukinabat. And everything before that was just more weirdness and joke songs and TV themes and commercials and stuff that didn't remind me of BOC at all. Maybe there was a synth melody here and there or something. But, like, there were still highlights in this section. I guess the first track, We've Started Up, was like some weird funk vaporwave crossover before vaporwave was a thing. And Staircase Whip has a nice melody, I guess, even despite being carried by modulated voice samples. To the Wind has a cool psychedelic vibe, and David Came to Mahanaim is some cool acid house kind of stuff. And once things actually start to sound like Boards of Canada, you do actually get quite a few other highlights, like Mukinabat, Kite Racer 2, BMX Track, Xander 2, Magic Teens, which sounds like a prototype of Ammo Bishop Roden, by the way, Bucky High, Powerline Misfortune, which could have been At Home on Tomorrow's Harvest. But there was one song near the end that I particularly liked, and that was Orange Hexagon Sun, which, as you guessed, uses the beat to Turquoise Hexagon Sun, although it has a different and equally good melody. I do have to say, it is pretty hard to believe this is even the same band on a lot of these tracks. Like the first volume, I'd recommend it mainly for the novelty of it. It gets very silly and embarrassing in some areas, even if nothing here is quite to the extent of embarrassing weirdness as The Way You Show. Heck, overall, despite the fact there were a lot more joke songs on Volume 2, I think it sounds much less like two teenagers who have no idea what the hell they're doing, for whatever reason. But otherwise, listening to these is like watching videos from the YouTube channel Grand Illusions, like watching this old British guy mess with his collection of toys. I still much prefer their public stuff as it's on actual good quality audio, and also because I like how they take stuff that can sometimes sound childish and silly and turn it into something darker and more atmospheric. Here they regurgitate blatant samples and joke around and occasionally find some time to do moodier synth work. It's not particularly characteristic of them from my perspective, but again, it's cool for the novelty of hearing them randomly fucking around. I'd say 7.3 out of 10 for this one as well. And finally, that leaves the Random 35 Tracks tape. Now, out of all the collections of unreleased material, this one here was probably my personal favorite. I had no clue what to expect out of this and was hoping we weren't going to get as many joke songs. And I think there was really only one that had anything resembling joke status, being A04, I think, which sounded like ass and was one of those dumb joke interludes from the old Tunes tapes without any sampled vocals. But the rest, while, okay, yeah, sound-wise it's scattershot as all hell, which I suppose is to be expected given the title, but it's all pretty good stuff. Songs were getting better fleshed out, they were taking themselves more seriously, and it's all pretty enjoyable. The main thing that surprised me about this collection was the variety, and also there were a lot of instrumental rock tunes. There were like 3 or 4 of those, and I liked all of them. Maybe a hint towards the direction they ended up going on Campfire Head Phase. Although some were really rough, like A07, by the way, I really wish they would just title these. But all the guitars were really intense and fuzzed out, and it was another one of those moments where I was like, is this even the same band? And they just kept switching up their style. One moment you get something like a fast Aphex Twin I Care Because You Do style drum and bass track. Then another moment you'd get an ambient interlude that actually sounded like Boards of Canada. And then another you'd get some kind of 80s inspired tune, and then you'd get some kind of Tim Hecker type track with a steady beat behind it. And then later you'd get this menacing track with some world music influences. Later you'd get a track that sounds like Jean-Michel Jarre or something. And it's just completely all over the map. Now, there were a couple of repeat tracks from other releases. For example, A11 is the outro to 6010, and B17 is the outro to Triangles and Rhombuses, both of which found their way onto Twoism, so I guess that brings us full circle. If I have any other major criticisms of Random 35 Tracks, is that there's not a lot on here that particularly reminds me of Boards of Canada. I mean, there are moments here and there, but so much of it feels like them trying so many different things and experimentations that they hadn't really pinned down their identities as artists quite yet. And once again, I kinda wish some of these had been released on actual good quality audio, but we got what we got. It's random indeed. But it is probably my favorite of these archive tapes. I'd say 7.7 out of 10. So, that ended a lot better than I expected to, despite how it started. I know I'm not the world's biggest BOC fan or anything, and I certainly don't like everything they've ever done, but I'd say this was fun. I hope you enjoyed watching this also. Next will most likely be the top 10 list, so there's that to look forward to. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.